Let's begin our deeper look into Mexico. And we're going to begin this by looking at what I would consider the pros and cons of Mexico. Now, I believe it's only fair that if you're going to talk about someone else's country, that the best way to do this is to begin by asking the very people who live there what they themselves think of their own country. And if you asked Mexicans whether they believed Mexico should be a rich country or a poor country, everyone who lives in Mexico would tell you the same thing. And that is, Mexico should not only be a wealthy country, it should really be one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Now, imagine as Americans if to our north we bordered Canada, a country with significant economic prowess, and to the south we bordered a country that had similar economic characteristics to Canada. That would not only benefit the United States, it would also benefit Mexicans. So we're going to look at what I would consider to be very positive characteristics about Mexico, and then we'll examine some of the negative things, at least as far as I see them as a geographer, about Mexico. So let's begin with some of these positive characteristics. Mexico has an excellent site and situation. Now, these are quintessentially geographic terms in the way I'm using them. If you recall, I told you earlier that when we look at regions from a world regional geography perspective, we're looking at both physical characteristics and human characteristics, and that's what both of these terms are describing. So we're going to begin with the physical characteristics, which are site characteristics. So the word site from a world regional geography perspective means the physical characteristics or the physical character of an area. So is the place rugged? Does it have mountains? What are the water resources and things like this? Mexico has an outstanding site. It's 2/3 in the tropical zone and 1/3 in the northern mid-latitude zone. Now, what does that mean exactly? If you look at those two arrows on the right-hand side on that map, you'll see that one of the arrows is pointing to the Tropic of Cancer, which is at 23.5 degrees north latitude. And then the other arrow is pointing at the Tropic of Capricorn, which is at 23.5 degrees south latitude. Everything between those two lines, which is 47 degrees of latitude, is found in what's known as the tropical zone. Now, the tropical zone has this very simple characteristic to it. It's hot year-round climatologically. Most people who live in the tropical zone judge what's happening with their seasons, not so much on whether it's hot or cold. So winter and summer aren't seen the same way they would be seen in North America, for example. It's mostly seen as the wet season and the dry season. And this is very, very typical for places in the tropical zone. Now, the northern mid-latitude zone has as its parameters every place from the Tropic of Cancer, which is 23.5 degrees north, to the Arctic Circle, which is at 66.5 degrees north. So all of this area in here. And the characteristic of the mid-latitude zone is this, is that it has a warm to hot summer and a cool to cold winter. Now, there's also a mid-latitude zone in the southern hemisphere, as you can see here. And its parameters are from 23.5 degrees south, which is the Tropic of Capricorn, to 66.5 degrees south, which is the Antarctic Circle, so in this area here. And it has exactly the same type of characteristics, which is warm to hot summers and cool to cold winters. However, make note of this, that in the southern hemisphere, so every place south of the equator, the seasons are opposite from what they are in the northern hemisphere. So for example, if we were in California and it was summer, that would mean that in Chile, in South America, it would be winter. And when Chile flips from being winter into spring in the United States, we would be flipping from summer into fall. So the seasons are opposite. Now, what this does for Mexico, being 2/3 in the tropical zone and 1/3 in the mid-latitude zone, is it provides for climatic diversity. And climatic diversity is important because it allows you to grow a variety of crops. Whatever problems you've heard of with Mexico, one of the problems you have not heard of is starvation. This is not something that's a problem in Mexico. And as we know, Mexico was part of Mesoamerica at one time, back when the great indigenous cultures were around. And these are people who domesticated all sorts of things that are eaten all over the planet, from corn to tomatoes to chocolate to all variations of squash to all sorts of beans. So food is not a problem there. Now let's take a look at some other site characteristics of Mexico. First of all, it's bicoastal. What that means is that it has two coastlines. So there's a western coastline and there's an eastern coastline. What that means for Mexico is that its trade relations do not rely on having good relations with other countries when they pass through them. So for example, if you were Belize, which you can see on the bottom right-hand corner of that map, Belize borders the Atlantic, but Belize does not border the Pacific. And as a result of that, if Belize is going to trade with people on the Pacific Rim, so all of these countries all over Asia through the United States all the way down to Chile, if they're going to trade with a country along the Pacific Rim, they have to either maintain good relations with one of the countries that they're around so they can move through, so for example, Guatemala, or they have to go through the Panama Canal, which is not free, or they have to sail all the way around the southern tip of South America. All of these things are disadvantageous. Mexico does not have to worry about that. Whoever they're going to trade with along the Pacific Rim, they just can go straight out and trade with them. They don't have to ask anybody's permission. And the same thing along the Atlantic side. Whoever they're going to trade with along the Atlantic side, they don't have to ask for permission from any other country. They can just go straight out and trade with those other countries. Here's even more on site characteristics. Mexico is an excellent natural resource base. A natural resource is anything that is inside the ground that you pull out of the ground or along the surface that you can utilize for human necessities. It's one of the world's leading producers of mineral resources, and this includes oil, silver, gold, iron ore, copper, zinc, and coal. Now, regarding situation is a human characteristic. And in a strict way, it means this. It's the location of a place relative to other people and places. But basically what it means is, who is your neighbor and what are your neighbors like? Now, in the case of Mexico, they border the United States. But I want you to think yourself of, what is your neighborhood like? What are your neighbors like? Do you have good neighbors? Do you have bad neighbors? Do you have completely unknown neighbors? Well, this is a critically important thing for a country. If a country borders another country and that country is always aggressive, this is going to cause problems. If a country borders another country like South Korea, North Korea, and they don't have any real relations, they can't trade with each other. Well, Mexico borders the United States, and the reason this is a positive for them is because the United States is really the biggest market in the world. So if you can sell Americans something, you can sell them lots of things. Think about your own house or other houses you've been in. When houses were built in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and even 50s in the United States, most bedrooms had very small closets. Today, when a house is built, they're all built with walk-in closets. When I was a child, a garage was used, hold on to yourself, to park a car in. Now garages have become our personal storage units. What changed? What changed is that we buy a lot more stuff. And Mexico is directly tied to the United States economically, as it's also tied to Canada through something called the USMCA, which is the United States, Mexico, and Canada Trade Alliance. This is formerly NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And what all trade agreements try to do is break down tariffs. A tariff is a tax on an imported good. And the way that works is something like this. You know that we manufacture cars in the United States, think Ford. And you know that Japan manufactures automobiles also, like, for example, Toyota or Honda. If the United States wanted to encourage Americans to only buy American cars, one of the things they might do is they might put tariffs on Japanese cars. And by doing that, Americans would still be allowed to buy Japanese cars. It's just that the government would be able to tax those cars at a higher rate. And by doing that, the government would either raise the price of the car so high that it might dissuade some people from buying that car, Or if you buy the car, the government wins anyway because it gets taxes out of this. So this is basically what tariffs are about. Now, there are some other positive situational traits that Mexico has. Amongst them are that Mexico has basically a unified Mexican culture. And culture is the learned traits of a group of people, and that can include things like very simple things that anybody would be able to figure out. Like what people eat and drink. I think we all know if I say Mexican food to you, you know what I'm talking about. What things people value. Mexicans really value family. What language people speak. Obviously, Mexicans speak Spanish, and it's a uniquely Mexican version of Spanish. And maybe what religion people practice. So those are all characteristics of culture, and Mexico's culture is more or less a unified culture. In addition to that, the population of Mexico has 130 million people. Whether that's big or small, it sort of depends on a lot of things. Overpopulation is not something it's easy to put your finger on. It's not simply just about population density, but the population breaks down like this. 60% of the people are mestizos, about 30% of the population are indigenous, and about 10% of the population are European in some way. They would consider themselves to be 100% European. And that may look like diversity, but if you think about it for a moment, everybody who's a mestizo is related to indigenous people and Europeans. Everybody who's indigenous can be related to mestizos, and everybody who's European is related to mestizos. So in a lot of ways, there's not a lot of diversity that's going on in Mexico. In addition to that, 80% of the population is urban, and about 85% of the population is Catholic. Now, I say they're Catholic. Mexicans are not overly church-going people. If they were, people would be on the roofs of the churches when Mass is going on, and that is definitely not what it is. But Mexicans are absolutely culturally Catholic people. And what this means is that unlike, for example, a place like Syria or Iraq, where there's been this sectarian religious violence going on, Mexico really doesn't have that. And in addition to that, in a lot of places, Mexico's a very developed country. And there's a growing middle class in Mexico. It's an obvious growing middle class in Mexico. Just like most of us walk around with cell phones, most people in Mexico walk around with cell phones. Many people have very nice automobiles in Mexico. Many people take very nice vacations in Mexico. In a lot of places in Mexico, when you turn on the water, you can actually drink the water. When you go up to an ATM machine, you put your card in, money comes out. There are people sitting at cafes in Mexico City and in Guadalajara and in Monterrey. They sit outside. They have a nice bottle of wine. They have a nice meal. You know, they may very well be dressed in very, very nice clothing, driving around a Mercedes and all of that. So in a lot of ways, Mexico has many, many things that it has going for it, which obviously brings up the question of, well, then what is wrong?